The scripture reading for this morning is from Philippians chapter 1, verses 15 to 18. Philippians 1, 15 to 18. It is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I am in chains. But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice. Yes, and I will continue to rejoice.
Okay, great. It's good to see you all this morning. I've always felt that one of the most underrated forms of art is the television advertisement. And I don't know if you have to be a little bit close to my age to remember that there was an advertisement on something called Doordarshan about a brand called Onida. About something called televisions. Now, you may not know what televisions are, but they're much larger than your laptops and your phones. So, and this ad was about this creature, kind of a green little horned monster, presumably the devil, who kind of wanders around this television. And the slogan of the ad was "Neighbors envy, owners pride." Neighbors envy, owners pride. And it's very interesting because what we're looking at today is going into the heart of that feeling of envy and rivalry and selfish ambition. Because here is Paul. He's in prison, and in a sense he's a political prisoner. I mean, long ago in the ancient world there was these things called political prisoners. We don't have them anymore in modern democracies, but they used to be there. And political prisoners mean he's in prison because he's a threat to some political interest. And that's one problem enough. But now he's got the added problem of fellow believers, fellow preachers who are using the opportunity to kick him in the dust, leave him behind, and get ahead. And here is Paul in this midst of this situation being joyful. And you have to ask how. How can you be joyful when all this chaos is happening? So you're in prison, there's people trying to step on you and get ahead of you and leave you behind, making you eat their dust in a sense. How do you remain joyful? And what Paul is going to be doing in this passage is kind of demonstrating and modeling something we talk about a lot at Redeemer, which is preaching the gospel to yourself. And also Martin Lloyd-Jones once posed the question, do you not realize that most of the problems you have are because you're listening to yourself instead of speaking to yourself? So there's this constant inner monologue in our minds that's constantly feeding us with all kinds of lies, and we believe it. We are listening to ourselves and not speaking to ourselves. So Paul is actually going to show us how to do it. And in order to do that, we've got to first ask a couple of questions. So one is, how do people typically respond to difficult situations and difficult or trials in general? There's two general responses. One is to detach yourself, kind of say, okay, you know what, keep your expectations low. Don't get your hopes high. Just stay realistic, and there's less chance of disappointment. So the one thing is to detach yourself from expectations. The other thing is to throw yourself into your expectations, like go big or go home. Wear your heart on your sleeve and just jump in. Whatever happens, happens. But better to have, so in romantic senses, better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. That kind of stuff. But Paul is actually doing neither. See, Paul is actually reorienting himself. He's recalibrating himself. He's looking at the furniture in his heart and he's rearranging the furniture in his heart. And that's how we respond to these situations. We reorient ourselves. And Paul is going to show us how to do it. So we're going to see three things. We're going to see him look at these things and those things and that person. So these things, those things, and that person. The first thing, let's look at it. Paul says in Philippians 1:15 onwards, he says, it is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so out of love, knowing that I'm put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing they can stir up trouble for me while I am in chains. Now, it's very important to see what Paul is doing here. He's not in denial. He's not in denial. It's very difficult to trust people who are in denial. I don't know if you've ever felt whether you can really trust Christians, because they don't really see all the hypocrisy that's in the church. They're in denial. They don't admit it. They don't acknowledge it. But here is Paul. He's not in denial. He begins by saying, it is true. It is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. And he names three things, right? So these dark things: envy, rivalry, and selfish ambition. And the first thing that's very important in learning how to preach the gospel to ourselves is to not be in denial, but to see these things for what they are. These things are real. Envy, rivalry, and selfish ambition, not just in the church, but among preachers in the church. So this is particularly interesting because here is the first church, the early church, recognizing at the very beginnings of the church, this is a problem. So if you're an observer of Christianity, you need to know this, that Christians actually care about this. Christians, and in a sense, we care about it maybe even a little bit more deeply than you do. And there's a history of Christians looking at the church and saying, listen, this is a problem. It is true. It is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry and selfish ambition. But these things are also pervasive. See, these things are not just limited to preachers or to Christians alone. It actually is pervasive. So envy is this feeling of misery that you get when you see someone else happy. When you see someone else get something new, something better, something good, instantly you feel as if you've lost something, even though there's actually no loss. You haven't lost anything, but it's just that somebody else has gained something, and instantly you feel like you've lost something. And there's a thing nowadays called Instagram envy. It's actually a psychological thing. And Instagram envy basically suggests that when you could be perfectly happy with your life, you could be perfectly happy with how things are going. You open Instagram and suddenly you see someone who has posted this perfectly filtered picture in a foreign country, sipping coffee, overlooking the Caspian Sea or whatever it is. And then suddenly you're miserable. Because that's what Instagram envy is. And Instagram envy is so real that the New York Times article in the New York Times article was being talked about. The writer says it's actually a new form of torture, and it's the feeling of being suffocated by fabulousness. It's the feeling of being suffocated by someone else's fabulousness, and this new kind of torture is something self-inflicted. We're doing this to ourselves, and so that's what envy is like. And the article actually even says, and this was written in 2015, so very haunting words, but it actually says that unless all Instagram users get offline immediately and ditch this thing, we're going to see an epidemic of Instagram envy without any cure. Haunting words, for our season. But here's the thing about these things, envy and rivalry and selfish ambition. They're the kind of things that Christians aren't looking to find. So they're, for Christians, we're kind of aware of things that are more obvious, like anger or lies or deceit or injustice or lust. Those things are kind of, I can sense it, I can see it. But envy, rivalry, and selfish ambition, these kind of sit under the surface. They're like these insects, cicadas. Cicadas basically go underground and stay underground for about 10 years, just burrowing underground. And then they come out and they live for 4 to 6 weeks. That's it. And then they wreak havoc. So these feelings are like that. These motives are like that. They just sit under the surface, and you won't find them if you're not looking for them. And if you assume that this is someone else's problem, you're not going to be looking for them in your own heart. But you only find these things if you look for them. And Instagram is helpful in that way, because Instagram is just a technology. It actually doesn't create envy. But Instagram is effective at exposing envy. It shows you if it's in your heart. And Instagram isn't the only thing now, but these things, you won't find them unless you're looking for them. And but the second thing is rivalry, and rivalry is on an axis of winning and losing. So if Instagram is on an axis of misery and happiness, and rivalry is on an axis of winning and losing. So it's kind of a zero-sum game. If I see you winning, that means I'm losing. And if I have to win, you have to lose, and I'm okay with that. So there's this sense of competition for superiority in the same field. So it's a zero-sum game. If I am losing, you're winning. If you're winning, and if I'm winning, you're losing, and that's okay. So there's this constant battling of trying to get ahead and the fear of being left behind. And rivalry goes so deep that there's this story that this guy Slavoj Zizek tells. He tells the story of a Slovakian farmer, and Slovakian farmer is faced by an angel. An angel comes to him, or God comes to him. I don't know what it is, but he says to the farmer, "Listen, I'm going to give you whatever you want, but whatever I give you, I'm going to give your neighbor double." So the farmer thinks about it, and he says, "You know what? Take one of my eyes, because I would rather lose one eye and have my neighbor lose two eyes than get anything for myself. So I would rather lose than see my neighbor win." That's rivalry. It's a sense of feeling like it's a zero-sum game. If I'm going to win, you have to lose. But the third thing is this selfish ambition. And selfish ambition is this purposeful, determined striving for something with zero moral inhibitions, without any moral inhibitions. This desire to get something, whatever the cost, and selfish ambition is on an axis of evil and good. And it's most hauntingly demonstrated in Heinrich Himmler, who is the leader of the SS, the Nazi party. And the SS is actually it's called Schutzstaffel, I think, and the literal translation is protection squadron. How do you like that? How is that for false advertising? Effective false advertising. Protection squadron. And he's the leader of the SS party. And he basically used to train soldiers and tell them, you know what? Any idiot can do great things for his country. Any idiot can do great things for his country. But it takes a true patriot to do something that you know is evil, and to do it anyway because it's for the good of your country. That's how he trained his soldiers. Any idiot can do something great for their country. But to truly love your country, it means you must be willing to do something evil for the greater good. That's selfish ambition. And that when selfish ambition is a seed, it can result in something as horrific as the Holocaust, or even something else as character assassination through gossip. Because so the seed is the same. That selfish ambition, that drive to get ahead and to win and to get this good thing, even if it means doing a bad thing in service of the greater good. So you never deny that what you're doing is evil when you're driven by selfish ambition. You justify it because it's serving a greater good. And the thing that's devastating about all these things is that they're ultimately dehumanizing. And they completely reduce people to either objects of opportunity or obstacles. So people are not people anymore. They're not persons. They have no intrinsic dignity. You're either in my way or you're going to help me on my way. So people are reduced to either opportunities or obstacles. And our relationships to them are in the context of trying to please them so that we can get what we want from them, or trying to pacify them so that we don't get what we fear from them. So it's totally dehumanizing to live like this. Now, look at and we don't have to live like this, because look at what Paul does next. He's now pointing to those things, which is the second thing. So he's not in denial of these things, and these things are devastating. They're real, they're pervasive, and they're destructive. But the second point is those things. And look at what he says there. He says, it is true that, I'm reading the same passage again, 15 to 17. It is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so out of love, knowing that I'm put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I am in chains. Now, and this is the second thing that Paul does in the process of preaching the gospel to himself is very crucial, because he doesn't get stuck with these things. We get stuck with these things. We can see these things that are going wrong in my life. We can see these things that are all going terribly wrong, these motives or whatever the situation. We can see these things. So it's very difficult to see these things and then say, but others. There's those things. There's those good things. There's those people who love me. There's those people who care for me. There's those people who are around for me. There's those things that are going well. There's those things that are actually real, that are actually as real as these things. And the thing about these things, envy, rivalry, and selfish ambition, all these things, they keep us stuck. They keep us trapped. We can't get out of it. It's like the most horrific picture I can give you is this picture of this mouse trap that these people have devised. It's like the sticky glue thing that you put on your kitchen counter, and a mouse gets stuck in it and it can't move. And then it's just dying slowly. It's stuck. And that's what envy, rivalry, and selfish ambition do. They keep us stuck in these things, and we can't look at those things. But you see, Paul is free. Paul is free. He's not stuck. He's not trapped. He's free to see that these things are real, but there are those things: goodwill, love, and sincerity. And here's what they mean. So goodwill is used in the context again of in Colossians, where Paul is talking to servants and saying to them, render a service as goodwill to the Lord, not as to man. So he's saying, work as if you are working for God and not for human beings. So there's a sense in which whatever we do, we do out of this desire that we're not doing it for this person. We're actually offering it to God. We're actually offering it to God Himself. And sincerity has this sense of, openness and sincerity, that you can look into my heart, you can look into my motives, you can see me. There's no pretense. Sincerity is without pretense. Delhi is full of pretentious people. We don't like pretentious people, right? But this is the antithesis of pretentious people. There's no pretense. You're looking at them through a glass door. What you see is what you get. And then the third thing is this love. And look at what Paul says: the latter do so out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. See, love in this sense, in this particular context, is most conscious of what God is doing. They're least conscious of what anyone else is doing. And when they see Paul in prison, they see him in jail, they're not thinking to themselves, the Jews did this, or the Romans did this, or Caesar did this. No, God put Paul there for the defense of the gospel, and it emboldens them, it empowers them. So love is most conscious of what God is doing and acts accordingly. And the opposite is fear. Fear is least conscious of what God is doing, and it becomes passive. It doesn't do anything. But love is most conscious of what God is doing, and it acts accordingly. And let me give you a picture of this from a story that Ravi Zacharias told in his book, Can Man Live Without God? He talks about, let me go back to what I was saying about Yakov, who's this evangelist in Yugoslavia where the church is politicized, they're corrupt, and there's a lot of damage been done. So Yakov goes to these villages to talk to people and befriend them. One of the people he meets is a man named Zimmerman. And Zimmerman kind of unburdens his heart with Yaakov, telling him about all the atrocities that the church has done in the name of Christ in his own village, and his own nephew was killed by people in the church. So he's bitter with Christianity. He says, I want nothing to do with Christ. And Yaakov just listens to him and befriends him and is there for him and visits him over and over and over again. At one point, Yaakov tells him a story. Tells him a story of a court. And the reason he tells the story is because earlier Zimmerman has told him, I know all these people, they wear these robes, they wear these, these hats and all of these dressings and all of these things, but I know their evil desires and I know their evil lives, and I want nothing to do with them or with Christ. So Yaakov at one point tells him a story and says to him, listen, Yaakov, imagine if I steal your coat and I go out and I rob a bank, and the police see me, but they can't recognize me. And they try to pursue me and they chase me, but they can't catch me. But the only clue they have is the coat. And they know that it is your coat. And they come to your house and they say, Zimmerman, we saw you rob a bank and we want to arrest you. And he asks Zimmerman, what will you do? And Zimmerman says, I would deny it. I had nothing to do with this. And the police would say, no, but we saw you. We saw your coat. And this illustration really made Zimmerman angry. And he says, he kicked Yaakov out of the house. He said, get out of the house. And later on, and time goes by, and we don't know what exactly transpired in the years, but as Yaakov continually befriended Zimmerman. At one point, Yaakov comes back to Zimmerman's village into his house, and they're talking, and Zimmerman is telling Yaakov, and he begins to ask Yaakov, "Can you tell me a little bit more about Jesus? Can you tell me a little bit more about who this person is?" And Yaakov begins to tell him after a long time of just befriending him, being there for him, listening to him. And he begins to tell him about Jesus. He begins to tell him about how to trust Christ and how to invite him into his heart and how to repent, how to believe. And Zimmerman gets on his knees and he begins to weep and he just asks Christ to come into his heart. And then he says to Yaakov, he looks up to the heavens and he says to Yaakov, "You wear his coat really well. You wear his coat really well." And that's the question we all need to ask ourselves, how can we wear Jesus's coat really well? Because we know there are people who are not wearing it well. It is true. But how can we wear his coat well? And that's where you get to the last thing that Paul does here. He talks about that person. So there's these things, he says it is true. There's those things he recognizes there are others who, out of goodwill, out of sincerity, out of love, uh, preach Christ. But then he says there's that person. And look at verse 18. Here's what he says. But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice. Now, and he says, because of this I rejoice, and because of this I rejoice, and I will continue to rejoice. So he's rejoicing, and he's determined to rejoice. Now, how is that possible? So first of all, I want to clarify one thing. When Paul is talking about these preachers, he's not talking about false teachers. These are not false teachers. Paul would not tolerate false teaching. Later on in chapter 3, we're going to see Paul come down really hard and really strong against false teachers. He's talking about people who are preaching Christ, who are doing the right thing but with the wrong motives, with false motives. And their motives are against him. They want to leave him behind, and they want to continue preaching Christ. So Paul is saying, what does it matter? So we're going to see how Paul is modeling for us what preaching of the gospel looks like. So you recognize these things, but you also pay attention to those good things. But finally, he's looking to Christ, and he's saying, and he does it by doing two things. He asks a question, and he reorients his heart's position. So first, the question, right? What does it matter? What does it matter? Now this is not indifference. This is not, I don't care what's happening, because we've already seen him say, it is true that these things are happening. So he's not in denial, but he's actually reordering the importance of these things. What does it matter? So he sees the dark reality of the situation. Some people are trying to take advantage of the situation and put me put me down in order to get ahead. But he also sees the good reality of the situation. There's others who love me. But he's not in denial of these things, but he's recognizing this is not the important thing. This is not the most important thing. This is a real thing. These things are real, but they're not the most important thing. That's what he says. The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice. Now, throughout this short passage, it's like 3-4 verses, Paul has made reference to preaching Christ 5 times, 3 times directly, once by saying, there are those who do so, who preach Christ. And the 5th time is just by referring to the gospel. So 5 times he's got this primacy of the preaching of Christ. And when you think about that, what does it mean to preach Christ to ourselves? And if you look at Jesus, when he responded to the envy and the rivalry and the selfish ambition in the disciples, they were on their way and they were arguing among themselves, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus has them come together and he sits them down and he brings a little child. And he brings a little child and he shows them he shows them and he says, truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. And this is important because let me read to you a quote from J.I. Packer. It's one of the really one of the solid men of God we've seen in the last century, and he passed away recently. He wrote many books, and if you've read one of the books, is one of the books we recommend on our website, Knowing God, which was named one of the 50 books every Christian should read. And in Knowing God, he has this one chapter on adoption. And here he describes, there's a paragraph that I want to read to you from that chapter. Here's what J.I. Packer says. He says, "You sum up the whole of New Testament religion if you describe it as the knowledge of God as one's holy Father. If you want to judge how well a person understands Christianity, find out how much he makes of the thought of being God's child and having God as his Father. If this is not the thought that prompts and controls his worship and prayers and his whole outlook on life, it means that he does not understand Christianity very well at all." And that's gold. And you know what he's saying? He's saying your understanding of Christianity can never surpass your appreciation for the fact that we are adopted children of God. That ends envy, rivalry, and selfish ambition. Because here's what I want you to think about. I want you to think about what is characteristic about all of the great men of God and women of God throughout history. It's this, that they don't see themselves as men or women, or men or women of God. They see themselves primarily as children of God. And they enjoy being delighted in by God. That's their whole outlook on life. It is their greatest joy. And these people are not failures, right? These people are successful, they're fruitful. There are a lot of good things that follow them. But you know what they think about? They don't care. They do not care, because they know what the most important thing is. They know that they have a treasure being a child of God. They have a treasure in Christ. And they don't deserve, and they can't lose. It can't be taken away. So the thing that everybody is striving for, everybody would think, not because of that thing itself, they want it because of the something else that they might get if they get this. And children of God know they already have it. They already have it. That God is their treasure and God is their Father. How much do you make of the thought that God is your Father, your true Father? If you had the benefit of having a good father, this father is greater than that. And your good father is an earthly reflection of someone much more beautiful, much greater. And if your father was either missing or a less than good father, you have in God a true father, a true, deep, loving father, whose love for us is expressed in Christ. And we're free. When this happens, we're free from the constant pressure to try to prove ourselves to be real men and real women, whatever that means. And we're free to be children of God, delighted in by our true Father, and loved and cherished and free. And uh, when you think about this, you think about this image that's popular. I mean, it's not popular, but I've seen it a few times, where you have this medical professional who is a parent, and they come home and they can't meet their child. Right? They can't be with their child because there's a risk of infection. So here's this parent standing outside a glass door, reading a bedtime story to the child on the other side of the glass door. And this child doesn't know what's going on. It can't understand what's happening. It doesn't know why its parent is on the other side of the door. And this parent is there because they know what they're doing is good for the child. They're trying to protect the child. And it's kind of a heartbreaking image, but it's in some way an image of what God is like, but it's not enough. Because see, when God saw us in that situation, he wasn't content to stay on the other side. He sent his son into the room to be with us. And he sent his son into the world to take our envy, to take our rivalry, to take our selfish ambition and all of its wickedness, and take it to the cross and kill its power and destroy its power. And he did that out of goodwill, out of sincerity, and out of love. And he demonstrated for us what the love of God is like in doing that. And God, when he does that, he then sends his spirit into our hearts. And the spirit of God is singing to our hearts the song of adoption. He's testifying to our spirits that we are children of God, that we are loved by him. And the struggle we're going to have to face is to recognize that if we're in envy, rivalry, and selfish ambition, maybe it's because the most important thing is not the most important thing in our hearts. There's been a false appraisal of some things that have become the most important thing, and they're keeping us in all of these emotions and motives. But maybe when we rejoice in what is truly the most important thing, it will resolve so much of what we think is vital to us proving ourselves when we don't need to. And I want to give you a picture of how this works out. There's a story in Greek mythology of the song of the sirens, and the sirens are these three sea nymphs. They're kind of these monstrous creatures who, whenever they hang around sailors, so whenever a ship comes by with sailors, they sing a song, and the song drives the sailors mad, and they kind of kill themselves, and they destroy these sailors' lives just by the song. So here's the Argonauts who want to go through this passage, and they know what's going to happen. They know the sirens are going to sing a song, and they know that it's going to result in death. So the Argonauts have a strategy. They have they have Orpheus with them, who is the most melodious singer in the world at that time. And they have Orpheus stand at the ship, and they have him sing a song and play music that is more beautiful than the song of the sirens. And when the Argonauts go by, no one can hear the song of the sirens, because there's a more beautiful song that they're listening to and their hearts are tuned to. It has no power over them. They've sailed through without any trouble because they're living in the power of a better song. And that's the song that's stuck in their heads. And I want you to know that that's the kind of God we have. That's the kind of Father we have. And we get this picture in Zephaniah 3:17, where God says, "The Lord your God is with you. He is mighty to save. He will take great delight in you. He will quiet you with his love. He will rejoice over you with singing." And my prayer is that your heart, through God's Spirit, as you meditate on God's Son, will press this song into your heart. And it'll be the song that is stuck in your heart. And that the power of envy or rivalry or selfish ambition will not have any sway over you, but you will live and be free to preach Christ and proclaim and be a witness to him out of goodwill, out of love, out of sincerity.